Hello everybody and welcome to this Kids for Sale, Children and Digital Advertising webinar hosted by Global Action Plan. My name is Oliver Hayes and I'm the Policy and Campaigns Lead here at Global Action Plan. Just so you know, also attending the webinar are a number of Global Action Plan staff, including our joint CEOs, Sonia Graham and Chris Large, and our chair, Jeremy Oppenheim. Thank you very much for joining us, and we're incredibly grateful to our lineup of panelists who are joining us today, 4 of whom are in different time zones. So this is a truly international event, and we look forward to hearing some international perspectives. So the speakers you're going to hear from today and who will be discussing this issue of digital advertising to children start with Professor Tim Kasser, who has for decades focused his research on values, consumer culture, well-being and ecological sustainability, and is going to speak about the harms of marketing to children and some common misconceptions. And just to let you know that Tim has pre-recorded his video because he lives in a rural location. We weren't totally sure that the internet would hold up to it, but he is joining us live for the Q&A. Then we'll hear from Professor Sonia Livingstone, who is a global authority on media audiences, especially children and young people's risks and opportunities, media literacy and rights in the digital environment. Sonia is going to speak a little bit about what it's like to be 13 and under, and children's rights regarding their evolving capacity and child development. Baroness Beeben Kidron is a film director, a producer, and children's rights campaigner and member of the UK House of Lords. She is the founder and chair of the Five Rights Foundation and will speak about the development of the groundbreaking new age-appropriate design code. Nandini Jami co-founded Sleeping Giants, the social media campaign that alerted advertisers that their ads were funding hate speech on Breitbart News. Nandini is dedicated to ending systemic racism in tech and media, and in June this year she launched Check My Ads to help brands understand where their digital media is, where their spend is flowing, and redirect it towards media that supports their brand values. Nandini is going to speak a little bit about the potential risk to brand safety of targeting ads at children. Pedro Hartung is a lawyer, legal policy and advocacy coordinator and researcher on human and children's rights at the Alana Institute in Brazil. In 2006, the Institute launched the Child and Consumerism Program to raise awareness of child consumerism and advertising targeted at children. Josh Golin is the Executive Director of the Campaign for Commercial Free Childhood, which is the leading US organization committed to helping children thrive in an increasingly commercialized, screen-obsessed culture. Josh is going to speak about the landmark 2019 Federal Trade Commission settlement with YouTube regarding their profiling of kids. And finally, we're very excited to be able to include Duncan McCann on the panel, who, as of yesterday, is now publicly known as the representative claimant in a new lawsuit in which Google is alleged to have violated the privacy rights of kids on YouTube. Duncan is going to tell us a little bit about the inside track on that case and on campaigning initiatives that we can all work on. So if you have any questions for the panel, please just type them into the Q&A box that I hope you can all see on Zoom as we go. And we will direct the questions to relevant panelists later on in the webinar when we have a Q&A. We'd be very grateful if you know how to do this, if you could rename your appearance on Zoom to include any organizations or institutions that you're representing, just so we know who is asking the questions. So I just wanted to say a little bit about Global Action Plan. We are an environment charity and committed to the idea that what is good for people is what's good for the planet. And I think at the moment, possibly nobody has ever been more aware of the extent of environmental breakdown, large parts of the planet being quite literally on fire as we speak, but equally the growing and very severe well-being crisis among young people. And Global Action Plan firmly believes that these are driven by some of the same forces, none less than consumerism itself. At the heart of that 21st century consumerism is the manipulative and barely understood, poorly regulated world of targeted behavioral advertising, to which children are exposed just as much as adults. And that's why we've decided to start this campaign, which we're calling Stop Targeted Advertising to Kids, and why we've convened this webinar to learn from those who are expert in the field, who've been working on these issues for decades, and we hope join forces with a diverse range of people joining us, attending this webinar, to shape this campaign as we go on and create what we hope will be positive change. I was very struck when watching the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which has become very big in the last couple of days, that it ended with a remark that those who are kind of most critical of existing systems are actually some of the most progressive or most imaginative people as part of the conversation, and sometimes the most optimistic. We do believe that things don't have to be the way they are, and we're committed to trying to change them. And I hope that that's the spirit in which we will conduct this webinar and also the campaign as we evolve. So without any further ado, going to move on to Tim Kasser. And as mentioned, this is a pre-recorded video in which Tim talks a little bit about the harms of marketing to children and some common misconceptions.
I've been working on issues regarding children and consumerism for almost 20 years now. And in the talks that I've given and the papers that I've written, I've found that there are oftentimes two misconceptions that people commonly hold. And I'd like to try to address those in the time that I have with you. So the first misconception has to do with what is the problem with advertising to children. So some people think that the problem with advertising to children is that advertising sometimes advertises bad products, so highly sexualized clothes or very aggressive toys or that sort of thing. Other people think that the problem with advertising to children is the way that the advertising happens. So data are collected in some problematic way, or their children are encouraged to nag in the advertisement, that sort of thing. Now, I, of course, agree that both of those are problems, and I've done a lot of work over the years to try to help push back against those kinds of ads. But there's a deeper problem with advertising to children, and it has to do with the kinds of values that are encouraged by advertising. So advertising always is saying to people who are viewing the ad, if you buy this thing, your life will be better somehow. And so it encourages what we call a materialistic value orientation, this belief that what's important in life is to make a lot of money so that you can buy a lot of stuff or buy a lot of services, especially services and goods which increase your image and increase your status. And as shown in this first slide here, there's a lot of research which shows, in fact, that the more that people are exposed to advertising, the more priority they place on materialistic values. We've seen this in children and adolescents and adults and around a variety of different nations as well. These effects also hold after you control for other interpersonal influences on materialism. So even after you control for the influence of mother, father, peer, and sibling and how materialistic they are, the extent to which children are exposed to media still has an independent effect on how materialistic those children are. In another kind of study, what we found is that the rising levels of materialism in adolescents in America over about a 30-year period was directly associated with the extent to which advertising had become a bigger and bigger part of the overall economy. So why is it a problem that advertising is associated with materialism? Well, as seen in the next slide here, the problem is that there are literally hundreds of studies which show that the more that people hold a materialistic value orientation, the lower their personal well-being, the more depressed and anxious they are, the more they engage in compulsive consumption, etc. We also know that the more that materialistic values take hold of one's value system, the less pro-social people tend to be, the more racist their attitudes, the more they get in trouble with criminal activities, etc. The more that materialistic people are, the less they care about the environment, and the less likely they are to do things like recycle or ride their bikes or eat less meat, etc. And among children and adolescents, the more materialistic they are, the worse their academic motivation and ultimately their academic performance. Now, there are some studies which have totally tested this whole chain of events here. So there are 2 studies with children and adolescents which tested a mediational model and found that the more that children watch television, the more materialistic they are, and in turn, the lower their well-being. And similar results occur in adults. With the more TV watched, the more materialistic people are, and the worse their environmental attitudes. So hopefully you can see that even if we got rid of all of the advertisements for bad products, and if we got rid of all of the advertisements which are done in a bad way, there'd still be a problem with regard to advertising to children, because it inculcates this materialistic value mindset, and that mindset is associated with a variety of different kinds of problems. So hopefully that addresses the first common misconception. Now, the second common misconception that people have, in my experience, is that the issue of advertising to children is a lefty progressive issue, okay? And that people on the right or conservatives don't really care about this issue much. That has not been my experience in doing this sort of work over the last 20 years. Because there's lots of times when the left and the right join together around issues of advertising to children. Further, there's survey data which support this idea that this is an issue which appeals to people across the political spectrum. So in 2014, my colleagues at the Center for a New American Dream and I did a survey of Americans, about 1,800 Americans, and we asked them a variety of questions about advertising and advertising to children. And as is seen in this final slide, what we found was that there was strong support for regulation and taxation of advertisements aimed at children across the political spectrum. So as you can see, strong majorities of Republicans, Independents, and Democrats supported the idea of removing ads from schools' textbooks and from school buses. Majorities of Republicans, Independents, and Democrats were in support of having a 1% tax on advertisements in order to support paying for schools. And majorities of Republicans, Independents, and Democrats supported the idea of prohibiting ads on kids' television shows and on kids' websites. So hopefully this addresses that next misconception and shows that really advertising to children and ending it is something which you might be able to find a whole lot of support for across the political spectrum. And so that's one of the reasons I'm so happy that this event is happening today. And I want to thank GAP for sponsoring it and for inviting me to speak with you all. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Tim. Okay, so we're now going to move on to Professor Sonia Livingstone, who is going to tell us a little bit about what it's like to be 13 in today's media landscape. Sonia.
Thank you very much indeed, Oliver. So yes, I want to really focus on why we have come upon this idea of 13 as the bright line rule for regulating advertising and indeed defining children in this space. And I've been intrigued about where this age arrived at for a while. I want to, it may seem that what I'm going to say and focusing on the evidence doesn't wholly support the Global Action Plan. I want to say that I am wholly supportive of it, but I'd like us to be really clear what we're saying when we say the age of 13 becomes our kind of bright line rule. I'm thinking of COPPA in the US and GDPR in Europe. And what the kind of evidence is. So what are we saying about younger and older children? And I've been asking around in these circles for some time where the idea of 13 came from. And the main answer I can find is that it goes back to the work of Jean Piaget, famous Swiss psychologist in the 1920s and 30s, who argued that all children develop according to an invariant cognitive progression of ideas. And that round about 12, children become capable of the kind of abstract thought that allows them to say, I am being persuaded by somebody, or someone is trying to sell me something, or especially when those someones are unknown and abstract to the child. And the work from Piaget was very strong in formulating all the research around television advertising, which is what informed COPPA in 1998, because, well, up when the internet was just coming, and we'd had a wave of regulating television advertising to children. And I would like us to reflect a little on how different today's world is from the days when you could tell what was a television advertisement because it was very clearly marked out. This is an advertisement, and the advertisement by and large came from the company that was advertising the product rather than a complex data ecology of unknown and invisible players, which is what we're doing today. Because the idea was that round about the age of 12 or 13, a child could understand something about how they're being persuaded when it is clearly marked out and when they are told who is trying to persuade them and of what. And today we're living in a very different kind of a world. So I think many developmental psychologists would argue that the nature of that world would say children really need to be protected longer than 12 or 13, up to 18 as the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child would have it. But of course, what we know is that many of the questions about how advertising and marketing and data exploitation works today, many of those things are actually not comprehensible by the age of 60 or more. So these are not things that actually anyone understands very well, let alone children. Jean Piaget would never have said that at the age of 12, click, a light bulb goes on and all children suddenly understand equally well, and therefore we can move them into a different world. And yet somehow in the world of regulation, that's what we do. So if you imagine lining up a class of 12-year-old children, necessarily half of them will be shorter and half of them will be taller than the average. And of course, that's what happens in any psychological process. Most, as it were, do not fit the kind of the bright line rule of these averages that we construct. And what really matters for some of those are all the factors that make for the difference. Why are some children shorter and some taller? Actually, it's a big deal to do with health and nutrition and background. Exactly the same applies in the world of understanding about advertising and marketing. So an analysis I did recently of Ofcom's data showed that Ofcom, the UK communication regulator, asked children if they could identify whether the sponsored ad on the side of their internet screen was an advertisement. And the 11-year-old middle-class child had the same level of understanding as the working-class 15-year-old child. Class made an enormous difference to the age at which the average child could understand that. And so clearly there are many other factors that come into this. So our bright line rules are, if you like, classed and in that sense, unjust. So I wanted to make one more empirical point, and this may or may not be helpful to you, but another analysis that I did for Ofcom a few years ago now could not find, I looked at all the evidence on television advertising that and internet advertising and children's age. It's very hard to show that children are more easily persuaded when they're younger than when they're older. For sure, they learn more about the environment. They understand better about the nature of the advertising and the persuasion that they're subject to as they get older, but they are persuaded across the board. In fact, we are all persuaded across the board. And so there's a sense in which some of these discussions about age are quite curious, and I invite us to reflect upon them. And I increasingly think we should not be thinking so much about the comprehension of the child as the fairness of advertising to any child. And in that sense, I would agree with Tim's point that it is unfair to be advertising a very powerful, persuasive vision of a world to children who have not yet, as it were, reached the age of maturity to make their own decisions. So the final point I wanted to make or to throw in is to refer to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 5, which as a child rights framework, a universal child rights framework ratified by every country but the US, sadly, does not advocate that you can address children's rights through any of these bright line rules, precisely because of the variation and the many contextual factors that matter. And so it says treat children according to their evolving capacity, which makes sense in an individual decision when you have a child in front of you, because we've always got to balance children's freedom to participate in the world and the importance of adults protecting them from possible harm. And those are decisions that a rights framework wants us to make in each individual case. Many have said this is really impossible to make from a regulatory perspective, but I believe our next speaker has got the magic answer to this dilemma. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you for the segue. So we are now going to go straight on to Baroness Bevan Kidron, who is going to talk about the very new and groundbreaking age-appropriate design code here in the UK.
Well, thank you, Sonia, for that. And needless to say, I will start with saying I don't have the magic answer, but I have been asked to talk specifically about the code, and I'm not sure how familiar everybody is, so I will just say in 2 sentences. It was brought in as an amendment to the Data Protection Act of 2018, and it sets out a requirement for the Information Commissioner's Office to create a code that offers a high bar of data protection for children. So the particular question that I was asked today, in fact, I was asked 2 questions. One was to say, what difference does it make to have the code? And the other is, what difference does the observing of children's rights more generally online make in the question of behavioral advertising? And those are 2 enormous questions. But starting with the code, I think that there were a number of things, and I think that both Tim and Sonia have sort of referred to a couple already, which is that actually the first thing the code does is it transfers the responsibility of data protection from the user, i.e. the child, to the company providing the service or interacting with the child. And I think that that is a very big shift, and perhaps if there is a magic bullet, that might be the one for all of us in all contexts, is to identify who has the power and identify who has therefore the responsibility. The other thing that the code did was it actually established very clearly that a child is different from an adult in the realms of data protection. And building on what Sonia's just said, you know, that actually children don't have the development capacity to act in adult ways, therefore asking them to make adult decisions, whether they are under 13 or over 13, is actually an unfair ask. We did, because we invoked the UNCRC, also established that a child is under 18 and not under 13. And I know all the arguments that capacity rather than age, but I think that it is insidious that a law that was researched in the 2000s and became law, in 1998, became law in 2000, is actually, and about a world which was in no way like the world the children experience now, should be the marker for what adulthood is. And it has become online that the de facto age of adulthood is 13. And I often, in a more general audience, say, you know, would you send your 13-year-old out the house, you know, into the wide world with no protection, no transport, no information, no map, no light, no snacks, and not even tell them where they're going? It's not a fair ask. In the code, we evoke children's rights as a guiding principle, and therefore one of the provisions is that you must act in their best interests. And again, it was interesting that the regulator found it necessary to say that it is unlikely that the commercial interest of a company would trump a child's rights, needs, or well-being. So I think, again, we moved the responsibility to taking care of kids first before your commercial industry interests. And then specifically on the question of profiling, it actually says that you may not use a child's data to give them detrimental information or information that in any way goes against government guidance or formal guidance published by government. And I really would say and support entirely Tim's words on this, which is, it's not just about bad adverts, it's not just about bad material, but actually having that requirement for companies to not profile children, to give them material that is detrimental, gives us the opportunity to have a much broader conversation about what is detrimental. And in my view, as Tim said, just the whole idea of advertising is detrimental. I think the second thing about the code is really key, is that the way that it is constructed is explicit that it can't be cherry-picked. And this is a paraphrase, but it basically says, you know, it's 15 provisions, independent and cumulative, so that each one of them may only make an incremental difference, but together they form a significant change. So for example, if you say high default settings, that puts young people right from the beginning in a better place, but then you add data minimization that forbids bundling consent, and language that says to show you things you may be interested, and then add in a duty to uphold your own published terms. The intersection of those four things start to add up to something quite significant. And the truth of the matter is, if you add all 15 together, they offer a different vision of the digital world for young people. So the answer, the question I was actually asked was, what has been achieved? And I think the truth of the matter is we don't really know yet. We're at the beginning of a transition period. The law actually is sort of enacted at the end of the year. But I do know a lot of companies are working towards it, and they are treating it with seriousness and creativity. And the fact that it has been mandated has forced many of them, some of the companies that children use most, to reconsider their services in quite a profound way. Open remains the questions of compliance, enforcement, and adoption in other countries. So really, you know, its final impact is not yet known. But on the upside, I have to say, we've seen specific things from some of the big companies. We've seen everybody putting developer time, acting ahead of the transition. And I think that, you know, that as we look at other things like the Online Harms Bill, work in Europe and so on, we're seeing a lot of the attitude of the code being accepted as a normal way of treating children in the digital environment. So I think that the prospects look good. The second question I was asked to address was more broadly rights online, and it's really not worthy of the last 2 minutes, but let me throw a couple of things that maybe we can all pull back, come back to later. One is, you know, if we say goodbye to or we reduce behavioral advertising, many of the digital norms that go with it disappear also. So there's less reasons for surveillance. There's less reasons for endless engagement, for profiling. There's no reason for us to expect that they won't look for other ways to extract value. But the business model that sits behind behavioral advertising is really toxic for kids. So winning this battle is actually a more profound battle overall. And I think the second bit is really around opportunity cost. I think last 8 years, you know, I've been really miserable being an endless critic, because actually I am a proud user of tech. But I think that the cycles of nudge and stickiness, once removed, you see the opportunity to create user journeys that build on altogether different principles and practice and offer a much richer online diet for children. And there's something definitely exciting about a world in which, you know, kids could wander rather than one that keeps them dribbling and attached based on science from Pavlov's dogs. And the last thing, let me finish with, was Sonia and I earlier in the day were looking at some work that Amanda Third, one of our colleagues, had done, consulting children all over the world. And it was really stark that 4 out of 5 of the children were unconvinced that the free for data is a fair deal. And one child said, tech companies exist for profit and benefit for themselves rather than the safety or quality of the time spent on the internet, which makes them fundamentally untrustworthy. And I think that really is a fantastic answer. If the purpose of the digital world is commercial, then de facto, it's not geared towards children's best interests.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Bevan. And thank you for addressing those two enormous topics so succinctly in such a small amount of time. So we're now going to move on to Nandini Jami. And Nandini is going to talk a little bit about what the potential risks to brand safety might be of targeting ads at kids.
Hi, everyone. I think I'm actually one of the only people here who hasn't focused on researching kids in advertising in particular. I'm co-founder of Check My Ads, a brand safety consultancy, which I just launched a couple months ago after spending 4 years working on hate speech. So I was running a social media campaign called Sleeping Giants. Real quick, that is a campaign that started in November 2016 after the US elections to alert advertisers that their ads were appearing on Breitbart.com, propaganda outlet. And it was a very simple idea. We took screenshots of ads that we saw on Breitbart, tweeted it at the company to let them know, and we would hear back super quick because it was all taking place in the public eye. They wanted to look good. So it ended up becoming a crowdsourced campaign because it was just so easy to join in. If you have a social media account, you can join us in sending these screenshots. We were able to grow this effort to a community of over 300,000 people who helped us basically watch for these ads and to scale our efforts overnight. We were incredibly effective. We found out later on that Breitbart had lost 90% of its ad revenue within the first 3 months of our effort as a result of this campaign alone. So personally, I've spent a lot of time trying to get to the root of the problem. We haven't solved the problem of hate speech, and of course that's where I approach the problem. So why does ad-funded hate speech still exist when we've brought so much attention to it, especially when brand safety is something that all brands are so concerned about today and so attuned to. And I've realized that it's not just the hate speech problem, but pretty much every problem that we have in marketing today is related to or comes down to marketers chasing this holy grail, this concept that they can reach the right person with the right message at the right time. It's a concept that has been sort of stuffed down our throats for the past 10 years. The entire concept of performance marketing is that we, while we're scrolling the web, you as a brand will be able to target me and sell me the thing right when I'm the most receptive to hearing it. And I think that really is this delusion that marketers have jumped into head first, believing that they can spend their budgets more efficiently if they know more about you so that they can target you wherever you go. And I think that's what has led to an increasingly inappropriate advertising strategy that includes invading the privacy of, well, like of your kids' privacy, and this idea that mining your behavioral data is the only way to to connect with you. Frankly, it's like stalking, and it's happening to all of us, whether we are adults or children. So my job and what I'm working on, what my mission is to help marketers understand that this is a complete fantasy. The data that they're looking at is usually wrong, and this type of marketing is just breeding consumer mistrust. The fact is, you don't know who you are speaking to on the web. You don't know if a person is an adult or a child, or how old they are. If you dig into the data, you will see that a lot of these people are bots, or kids go on the internet and pretend that they're older than they are. There's not really an effective way to root that stuff out. So part of my mission is looking at the bigger pictures, to help marketers understand the bigger picture of how to build more sustainable marketing strategies, and to really think about the benefits of connecting with your audience in a way that builds their trust. And that means helping marketers break the addiction to invasive data mining strategies, to break the addiction to hyper-segmentation, and for them to realize that there's actually more to gain from investing in more holistic, sustainable marketing strategies that just involve developing messages to bigger audiences, rather than trying to find this super hyper targeted segment, trying to nail them down. Just think about what kind of bigger picture messages that you can send out in the world, and kind of step back and think about marketing like it used to be, where we built beautiful marketing campaigns that everyone could enjoy, and that didn't really require us to know every single detail about you in the first place. And I think that's a cultural shift that I'm trying to work towards, and I think that that's what's going to help us move away from a world where we're collecting invasive personal data about people, and especially kids. Got to stop that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nandini. So we are now going to move on to Pedro. Pedro, whose screen I think we should be able to see now, is going to tell us a little bit about the Alana Institute's work in Brazil and the progress that's been made there.
Sorry, can you hear me? No? Yeah. So hello everyone, it's a pleasure to talk with you today. Our main work in Brazil is to highlight that nobody's a born a consumerist, but rather becomes one, especially with the stimuli that children receive from the early years until the end of our lives, actually, with all the marketing targeted at them. In Brazil, even inside schools, we just won a case in our courts about McDonald's that they used to do different shows, educational shows about even sports inside schools, inside daycares here in Brazil. But and to show that this pervasive strategy here about commercial communication, marketing to kids, is all in all spaces that kids socialize, including internet. But I must highlight that our structural inequalities and multiple childhoods that we have here from different indigenous traditional communities here, Black communities, and here in Brazil, highlights even more this pervasive marketing strategies, and the impacts is even greater in our childhoods, different childhoods. Especially because in Brazil, we are among the biggest consumers of new technologies, new ICTs, and especially children. Even now with the pandemic, it's even worse, this consumption of new technologies, screens, and even digital technologies. And what we have in those digital technologies here in Brazil, we are well known from the high quality of our advertising in Cannes and every places. And they do a lot of advertising direct to children inside also in all the content in the digital environment, like this kind of games, YouTubers that we should actually, I must highlight, we should treat them as artistic child labor, and we should debate this more and how to really understand this massive phenomena about artistic child labor from digital influencers. And there is a regulation, specific regulation from the World Labor Organization, and we should enforce it and should talk with the companies that allow this kind of labor experience in the digital environment. But as you know, McDonald's, with all the Happy Meal in Brazil, it's a classic here for digital influencers, different kind of toys industry. And one that I should mention is the lawsuit prize. I don't know if you know this doll. And our research showed that the impact of all the advertising and digital advertising to kids from this specific toy, and we could represent all the plastic generated by this toy. The consumption of this toy represents 24 tons of plastic layers around the earth. And the main strategy behind this toy was kid influencers on YouTube. And it was huge in Brazil, and we know also in the United States. But in Brazil, it was a huge success and trend among the children. And what we do? We develop legal strategies, reporting abusive advertising and marketing communications to authorities and public bodies. Since the beginning, since 2007, we do different kind of legal strategies, reporting, some legal action, and we managed to win several of them. Recently, it took almost 10 years, as you can see from those dates, but we managed to go to the superior courts here in Brazil, and we won against different kinds of corporations, including McDonald's. Recently, 3 weeks ago, we won against McDonald's about this educational shows, supposedly, inside the schools here in Brazil. We do government relations, and part of our advocacy strategy is to really follow the new bills, follow new executive orders, as we call it here, and all the changes in the executive and legislative bodies here in Brazil. And we managed to pass a new regulation from CONANDA, which is the National Council of Children's Rights, really defining what is advertising aimed at children, their aspects, and how to really see it and to find it, including the digital atmosphere, which is harder, I must say. Right now, our work is a little bit, we have different challenges with the digital atmosphere, but also we develop educational strategies, promoting debates and social reflection of the problem of the consumerism in childhood, including one of our biggest and highlights we have here is the SATs that we have here in Brazil, like the college admission test. 1 year was about marketing to kids. So in one day, almost 7 to 8 million youngsters, they debated about marketing to kids, which was for our goal about creating awareness, a huge and important step. We do also research, consulting children, families about this topic, and almost in all our research, parents, they are pro-regulating, restricting marketing to kids, especially to under 12 years old. And we do also research with different organizations, with Harvard Leads, the Economist Intelligence Unit, which gave us this incredible data or info that banning advertising to children under 12 years in Brazil has a positive economic outcomes for all society, decreasing the rate of eating disorders, increasing happiness and well-being, better quality of psychological and social life, reduction of environmental and ecological degradation. We also work with the corporations to find new ways to, new pledges. Like Coca-Cola, we managed to create a new policy, internal policy of Coca-Cola to really restrict marketing to kids under 12 years old, and different corporations like Marco Ferreiro, Mars, and Lever. And we did 2 documentaries, one called Target Market Kids, which is the first one, not about digital. It was like 10 years ago, I think. And the second one, Way Beyond the Weight, about the crisis of the pandemic of, or epidemic of child obesity, and how all the marketing to kids from junk food is related to that. And also, as I must mention, the importance of the society that took this topic and created new movements like the Consumerism Free Childhood Mothers Movement, which is now one of the biggest advocacy group here from parents to really debate and to really pressure and to bring more pressure to the companies and to shift this idea that the mother or the family is the only responsible to the child's education, or this idea that media literacy will solve it all. The school should teach this. Parents don't know how to say no. We receive this kind of phrases from the companies in the public debate at the Congress, for instance. Families should be the one responsible to the child's education. They should say no when they ask, when they nudge, and not they nudge, but when they nag from different products. The families should be the one. But seriously, it's really this parental centrism that we have, and now we are bringing this parental centrism to the digital environment with this consentism that as we could say, that just with the consent or with the parents we should allow everything, but it's not the way we see it, because there is a symmetry between families, children, and companies, and we should find ways to help companies accountable for their products, for their services, and their practices. Especially the Convention on the Rights of the Child mentioned specifically the private actor's responsibility, like public or like in this Article 3, in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions. That we should think from the beginning, a company should think from the beginning, as Biban told us about the UK design code, which is for us an inspiration. We should find ways to really bring accountability while governing the company, while developing a product or a service, and while providing a product or a service for our children and their family. Because we need to find ways to protect children right now, not just for the future, but now. Children using all these new important technologies and internet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. And thank you also for covering so much ground. It's really amazing to see everything that's going on. So a message just to the participants. If you would like to put any questions to the panel, please do put them in the Q&A box, and we will make sure that they get answered when we see them. We'll have Q&A after the 2 remaining speakers who we're going to now. So next up, we've got Josh Golin, who is the Executive Director of the Campaign for a Commercial-Free Childhood in the States.
Thank you, Ali. It's great to be here and hear from so many colleagues who are doing such incredible work. So we've heard a little bit about COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act that we have here in the United States. As has been said by everyone, it's a inadequate law. It only goes up to age 12. There's a lot that's wrong with it, and we can talk about that in the discussion. But it is the only law we have here in the United States, and it does get some things right. And in fact, for a law that was written in 1998, it doesn't do that bad of a job. It gives us a framework for regulating things like the Internet of Things, and you know, for a law that was written before tablets or smartphones or internet connected device even existed, it does provide that framework, and it particularly provides it because of an update that was done in 2012 to COPPA, which so COPPA, the main thrust of COPPA is that you need to get parental permission, verifiable parental permission before collecting data from a child that's under 13 on the internet. And in 2012, the definition of what constitutes personal information was updated to include things like personal identifiers. So what that means is that we are not supposed to have any behavioral advertising to children under 13 here in the United States already, unless you are getting parental permission, and nobody is getting parental permission to behavioral advertise to a child. So any behavioral advertising that's happening to children in the United States is a violation of the law. Unfortunately, in addition to the weaknesses in how the law was written in terms of things like not going up to 13 and some of the other ways that we can talk about, the biggest problem we've had with COPPA has been a huge lack of enforcement. A study came out in 2018 that found that 57% of the apps that Google was recommending as being appropriate for children were violating this law, was collecting personal information and sharing it with third parties without getting parental permission. So you don't get to that widespread non-compliance with the law unless you have a massive failure of enforcement, and that's what we've had in this country. Which brings us to YouTube. So YouTube, for years, has been the #1 online destination for children. And until 2019, Google did not comply with COPPA when it came to YouTube. Google's defense was that the terms of service for YouTube say that it's for 13 and up, and therefore, as far as they know, there aren't children on YouTube, which is a pretty remarkable defense. It seems amazing to me that the only people in the world who don't know that children are on YouTube and love YouTube all the time are the people that work at YouTube, but that is what YouTube was claiming until fairly recently. And so in 2018, and in fact, the other thing that Google claimed is that we created a separate site called YouTube Kids, where there isn't this data collection, where there isn't this behavioral advertising, and therefore that's where the kids are, and therefore we don't have any responsibility. Now, the law doesn't say that. The law doesn't say if you create a separate kids site then you don't have any responsibility for children on your main site, but that's what YouTube claimed. So in 2018, we filed, along with the Center for Digital Democracy, who is our main partner here in the US on all our children's privacy work, we filed a complaint documenting all the ways in which we know that YouTube knows that kids are using YouTube and that they are legally collecting their data. The YouTube Kids site was actually enormously helpful in us proving this case because when YouTube started YouTube Kids, all that they did was they ported some videos that were on the main YouTube site over to the YouTube Kids app so that kids could watch it there, but they didn't remove those videos from the main YouTube site. So YouTube was in effect saying, we have children's content on our site, we're aware of it, and this is what we know kids want to watch. Obviously, everybody knew that YouTube was full of children's content, nursery rhyme videos, unboxing videos, just about any major children's media property is on YouTube. It wasn't just that children were finding YouTube, it's that content was being put deliberately there to draw them there, and that YouTube's algorithms were promoting this content. And in fact, YouTube was bundling this content for advertisers. So YouTube has something called YouTube Preferred, which is where they tell their advertisers, this is shows that we have programming that we have vetted, that we can say you'll get your best return on your advertising for. And so they would bundle all these children's shows together and say, here's how you can reach children. And so we filed this complaint documenting all these things. The FTC launched an investigation. I'm not confident that they would have done anything because the FTC is an incredibly timid and weak regulator when it comes to children's privacy, or when it comes to really anything having to do with children. But what we saw, what was fortuitous for us was at the same time that we were filing this complaint there was a much greater awareness of how data was being used by the big platforms and how it was being misused. The Cambridge Analytica scandal changed so much for people like me who are working in this space, and gave us opportunities both to tell our story more publicly through the media, but also to garner us allies in Washington, D.C. that we never had before, because all of a sudden this was a really hot issue, and this was, you know, cynically, one could say that it's a great way if you're a politician to get your name in the paper. Less cynically, I think there are many people in Washington who genuinely care about these issues, and they just needed to become aware of it. So in this new environment, we were able to put a lot of pressure on the FTC to act in this case, including getting a lot of support from Congress here in the United States. And to Tim's point, from both sides of the aisle here in the United States, we had Republicans who were very forceful in writing to the FTC and saying you need to do something. And so in 2019, in September, about a year ago, the FTC announced a settlement with Google. And as part of that settlement, they fined Google $170 million for violating COPPA. And they said, and Google agreed that going forward on child-directed content, they would not have any behavioral advertising and they would not collect data from children on those videos. And so what we now have, now that that settlement has gone into effect, and we're still analyzing the extent to which YouTube is complying with the settlement and what these changes really mean. But what you have now is that there is, when children are watching online child-directed videos on YouTube, they are only getting contextual ads. So the only thing that advertisers are advertising to on child-directed content is that a child is watching a Peppa Pig video at that moment they like Peppa Pig. They're not getting it based on, you know, their browsing activity, their web searches, their location data, so that they can target a child at their most vulnerable moment with the ad that will be the most effective. There are other positive changes as a result of this settlement too. So for the first time, Google had to acknowledge that they had kids under the age of 13, and that meant that they could change their advertising policies overall. So now on child-directed videos on YouTube, you also don't get things like fast food advertising or any food advertising, actually. You don't get video games. You don't get sexualized advertisements aimed on these videos, because now that they no longer have to pretend that, they no longer can pretend that kids aren't there, they have offered more protections, which is great. There's a number of weaknesses with the settlement. The fine was ridiculously low, so it didn't create the changes across the industry that we were hoping to, because it's easy for companies to write a fine like that off as the cost of doing business. It puts all of the onus on creators. And it only applies to child-directed videos. And so one of the things we know is that children watch all sorts of different videos, many of which are not child-directed. And one of the things we love about the age-appropriate design code is that it talks about content that is in sites that are likely to be accessed by children, not that you have to have actual knowledge that it's an actual child that's watching, or that it's child-directed content. So that's a huge step forward that we love about the design code. So there's a lot more work to be done in this space. Obviously, it's only one settlement, and there's some tremendous weaknesses to the settlement. That's one reason why we were thrilled to see the announcement of the lawsuit yesterday. But I want to just close by talking about, you know, my organization and the Center for Digital Democracy, our combined budgets when we were doing all this work was less than $1 million a year. And we were able to make enormous changes at the #1 online destination for children in the world. And if we had bigger coalitions, there is so much that could be done, particularly in this moment when there's so much focus on this. So here in the United States, things are so fractured. So you have the public health people who are only worried about junk food marketing. You have parents who are mainly concerned really about screen time and the content that their kids are being exposed to, and they don't necessarily understand how that relates to this toxic business model that we've been talking about this morning. And so there's an opportunity, I think, really to bring in way more parents if we can make that connection clear. The environmental movement in this country, at least, has not really wanted to address the issue of how advertising fosters materialism and unsustainable behavior. So thrilled to see GAP convening this. And then we have the privacy folks who are very concerned about what data is being collected, but aren't necessarily here, at least in the United States, so concerned about the advertising that results from that data collection. So if two groups with a budget of less than $1 million can make major changes at YouTube, if we can bring all of these groups together, all of these different sectors, and help them understand that the toxic business model that is affecting children in such dramatic ways, that is using the most powerful technologies that have ever been created for persuasion to persuade kids to want stuff that may not even be good for them, we have the potential to do so much more. And so I'm really excited by this convening, really excited about the idea of cross-sector collaboration, because this business model is really something that we all need to address to bring our work forward. And the quicker we recognize that and start collaborating on shared strategies, the better off children will be, and our missions. I think we will all be better at fulfilling these seemingly disparate missions if we identify that toxic business model and protecting children as a key. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Josh. And thank you for everything you've been doing on this for such a long time. Our final speaker is, we're very excited to say, now publicly known as the man who is taking on Google, at least here in the UK and in the EU. It's Duncan McCann, who is the representative claimant in the McCann versus Google lawsuit, in which YouTube are alleged to be stealing kids' data here in the UK and in the EU. So Duncan is going to tell us a bit more about that.
Brilliant, yeah, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak. It's really great to, having spent kind of 9 months preparing for yesterday, being kind of restricted from who I could speak to, it's really great to finally be able to speak to everybody about it. And indeed, I feel like I've told my story a couple of 100 times since yesterday. But so yeah, what I wanted just to give it to do is a bit of like background about how I got to the place I am today of taking on Google in the courts here in the UK, a little bit of detail about the case, and then about kind of the wider aims of the case. As I've said a number of times in the last couple of days, my primary goal isn't to turn kind of these infractions into damages claims. My real goal is to change the behavior and change the digital environment for children and the wider world going forward. So in my working, so I'm taking on this claim very much as an individual, very much as a parent. So I have 3 children under the age of 13. All of whom spend some time on YouTube, but obviously also on other platforms. But, and their age range is from the young, so 4 up until the, just under 13. And so I'm seeing all of those digital challenges in my household at the moment, from phones to screens to consoles to social media, to the peer pressure of being left out, as we're a family that maybe tries to hold back that kind of digital tsunami a little bit further than most. So was really coming to terms with all of these digital issues and very much from a child's perspective. And I think that's really useful to kind of have that in mind. And at the same time, was coming through kind of my professional experience. So in my day job, I'm a senior researcher at the New Economics Foundation, which is a London-based think tank. And in there, I lead the kind of digital economy program. And so in the last 3 or 4 years, I've really been looking at some of the key issues around how these companies have become so powerful, about how there's often a complete lack of accountability for them, and then thinking through some policy options about what we need to do about it. So this confluence of like understanding at a deeper level some of the big issues around the kind of the evolving digital economy, seeing them so viscerally happen and play out in my own personal family experience, it really prompted me to want to do more. And so in a fortuitous coming together, indeed Ollie and I were talking before Christmas about this project and how we might start to think about making it a reality. And he had been made aware through Foxglove that this case was being prepared, and put me in touch with the legal team who was starting to think through and starting to want to launch a case. And so together between me and the legal team, we've been spending the last 9 months kind of getting all our ducks in order, getting the funding that's needed to make it happen, checking with experts as much as possible to understand what's really going on, and obviously hugely inspired by the amazing work that Josh was able to get done in the US. So what's this case about? So this case isn't really about what many people have been talking about, which is the kind of the marketing end of the data chain. What we're really tackling here is that initial first point where YouTube is just collecting and in the technical jargon, processing the data of our children. So we're not going on to the second and third order, which is once they process that data, they're putting it into profiles and then maybe using those profiles to show ads. But we're really tackling that initial data collection effort. And obviously by making that, and so what we're alleging is that they have gathered that without the explicit consent required under GDPR. They require, data of under 13-year-olds requires special consent, and so they can't just kind of bundle it in. Now, it was obviously been hugely exciting these last 48 hours, but sadly, as with many legal cases, this is going to be a very, very long journey. So I don't expect a full outcome, bar a surprise kind of settlement offer from Google. I don't expect a real outcome until 4 or 5 years from now. And indeed, our next court date is probably not until the end of 2021. So sadly, in a whole year's time, as we wait for another Supreme Court judgment, which is looking at some of the key issues around data cases. Again, these are very new in the UK. In the UK, doesn't have a history of bringing class representative actions for data breaches. And so that is a point that still needs to be reaffirmed by the court. And the other thing that needs some work on is trying to understand how damages work for digital and data breach cases, where people often haven't been kind of directly harmed by the data. Indeed, they would probably have been totally unaware of the data being used. And so how can you then allege harm? So there's a couple of things that the court's really thinking on. And so why am I taking on this case? You know, it's not about the damages, which will work out at about £250 probably per children, although again, that's to be debated. It's such a new area of law, but it's really about getting those changes to happen, about, you know, supporting the work of, you know, BBAN and others who are trying to create this kind of safe digital environment for children online by default, not something that you have to kind of engineer and make happen. I also think, you know, from the way I look around at the tech companies and their compliance with GDPR, I see flagrant breaches of GDPR all over the place. And it's about time that these companies started to comply with the law. And in some ways, I see it as a bit analogous to the car industry in the kind of 60s and 70s, in that the products that car manufacturers were making were killing their users and maiming their users, as well as then pedestrians and other users of the built environment at an alarming rate. And regulators were coming in and saying, well, we want to put design codes, we want to start regulating the way you build cars, maybe safety features, seat belts, crumple zones, things like that. And of course, there was a huge backlash from the industry at the time. No, if you start to regulate us, you're going to kill the industry. We're an industry all about innovation and disruption and doing the latest thing. Now, of course, today we live in a highly regulated market for cars, where they have a huge number of regulations they need to do in terms of safety, in terms of build quality, and so on. And it totally hasn't killed off the car manufacturing industry. But even after those regulations were started, compliance only really started to happen once it became a real cost of doing business. Once, you know, important lawsuits at large scale started costing these companies huge fines, that is when you started to see these companies really start to incorporate these features into them. And indeed, you started to have companies then that marketed themselves because of these features. You know, the Volvos, we are the safest cars around. So you start to see people being able to differentiate based on these kind of criteria. And so I really see that the tech industry is in the same place that the car industry was in the 60s and 70s. We need those regulations in place. We're starting to get them with the Data Protection Act and other pieces of legislation from around the world. But now, importantly, we need that legal backup to kind of reinforce that behavior. And the final thing I'm going to say is that I think what's also really interesting about so before I kind of got into thinking more directly about children, is about how easily people brush off the idea of the digital and kind of data issues as something that people don't care about, very hard to get kind of cut through. I think some of the other speakers mentioned it already. But I think a conversation around children is a way to really, really engage people in a way that is so different from looking at their own data. And so hopefully this will be a kind of stepping stone to not only talking about protecting children online, but ultimately protecting everybody online from some of the harms of marketing and profiling and data collection. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan. And yes, good luck with the next 5 years of taking on the biggest company on the planet. I want to just start with a quick question for you, actually. Do you think that this case can trigger like industry-wide change, or do you think, were it to be successful and should a settlement be reached, it's going to be limited to the admittedly very big scope of YouTube and Google? Which do you think is most likely?
I think a bit of that's going to depend on the, as with all legal judgments, the devil is always in the detail. But if they go anywhere near what we're alleging, which is that a platform will no longer be able to rely on an obscure, long terms and conditions that was clicked on by an adult at some stage, which not only gave them the rights to that person's data, but to any other users who may or may not be using that particular device or platform. I think there, and obviously that the fine is obviously, the damages are in some ways commensurate with that. You're going to see companies have to take notice. And because obviously the other thing to remember is that any claim that is successful here in the UK will most likely also, by default, almost be a claim that's able to do in any other EU country. And so indeed any platforms that operate within the EU will have to take significant notice. Again, that all depends on the justice's ruling that YouTube have not gained the requisite consent required by the Data Protection Act and GDPR by hiding this thing in long terms and conditions. So you will absolutely get change of behavior. Either they'll have to make this consent and these terms much more explicit, which I think they should be doing in any case. And hopefully that will then lead to less people kind of agreeing to it, and hopefully to then wider change across the industry.
And a final question from me and other panelists, if you want to ask Duncan anything, please do chip in. What impact does Brexit have on this case? Interesting. So Brexit, initially complicated the case a little bit because we had to decide where Google, so the data controller for Google and for YouTube is in Ireland. And so the case requires us to serve Google in Ireland. And indeed, this is the first point that Google are really disputing as to whether the UK is indeed the right jurisdiction to hold this particular trial at all. And so first of all, we have to kind of establish this jurisdictional issue. So there are certainly increased admin issues and increased kind of legal issues with Brexit going forward. But ultimately, we should have missed most of those by filing during the transition period. We kind of filed in a previous regime, and so throughout the whole life of the case, we will kind of be living in a regime where we're kind of still in the EU, because that's when we launched the case. So hopefully, it won't have too huge an impact. But I think the wider impact of Brexit on this area that we're talking about is that the British government has committed to diverge from GDPR, and we don't know exactly what that means. Now, hopefully it means, the kind of work that BBAN and the ICO is doing is that we're going to go beyond and further, but we have to be mindful that with a Conservative government in place, we may also be heading towards lighter regulation in some other parts of the data protection. So I think that's definitely a risk post-Brexit. Thank you, Duncan. Can I just see if any of the other panelists wanted to ask Duncan anything about this case, or specifically about it? Okay. Even.
No, I mean, I offered to be an advisor on the case, so I'm all for it. I'm backing him all the way. I actually was going to make pick up on something he said. In fact, two things. One is, I think, you know, you mentioned Brexit, but I think an associated area of danger for all of this is actually trade law, trade bills, UK, US trade deal. So, you know, just when we thought life could not get more complicated, it did. And I think that all the people on this call should be, wherever they are in the world, should be mindful, in fact, of trade deals as a way of pulling out. It's an area where tech companies have pushed themselves in, where data flow, which we are all in favor of in one sense, has been defined in their favor, and where Section 230 gets embodied in international law in a way that complicates domestic law. So I think that's just an interesting area for us all to look at. And the only thing that I did also want to pick up, I think that Duncan's absolutely right. You know, if you diverge from GDPR, you could make it better, you could make it worse. My own experience is that actually there is not a clear ideological line on this issue. Yeah, that actually it's about the people who understand the most. The people who actually understand the most gravitate to versions of pragmatic intervention. Yeah, and the people who understand the least, wherever they come from on the political spectrum, actually give a whole load of false narratives. And I think that one of the jobs of this particular grouping is to actually, you know, start talking about where responsibilities lie, about, you know, about common things that are in place that are distorting the market. And one of the things that Duncan, I think, mentioned that is really, really crucial is around terms and conditions. I mean, what a regulatory failure, you know, to have the consent be tied up in something that we know that most people, I mean, you know, I don't know the exact figure, but it's over 90%, you know, high 90% don't ever read. What kind of consent is that, and how does that protect anyone? So you know, I think that we have to start, and in fact, I should say and point out to my colleagues at Five Rights that we're actually doing a project of creating a standard, an international standard for age-appropriate terms and conditions. So all the things you have to consider before actually making your terms and conditions if you want to engage with children. But I just wanted to pick up on those things. I think we've got a narrative issue about where the problem lies. I think we've got to all talk about where the responsibility is. And then we've got to look for the different places in the environment where the pushback is. And so things that, like the one that Duncan is doing, is important for whether he wins and loses. It's important for the story that he's telling the world about what fair looks like for his kids.
Wonderful, thank you, Vivian. Nandini, I'd like to come to you next and just sort of take it back to those conversations you're having with brands. Is there kind of widespread acknowledgement of what you said, that so much of this marketing spend is going nowhere, that it's that they've been sold a pup, that the wizardry of targeted behavioral advertising is perhaps not all it was cracked up to be?
I'm on mute. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's shocking. It's shocking if you take the time as a brand or as a marketer to look at where your ads are appearing, actually appearing, not just get a high-level report on the web, particularly on the open web. Up to, I mean, I've seen more than half of those ads go to waste because they're being served on sites that human beings don't visit. They're being served on sites, well, a lot of them are being served on hate sites where they get higher engagement. And they, the ad tech ecosystem counts on you. They're counting on you as marketers to not check where your ads are going. And they've created all sorts of, like I said, reports and dashboards to basically distract you from the raw data, which does show you exactly how much of your ads are just going to waste. That's why my work focuses on the brands themselves, because I believe that if brands and the marketers behind who control these marketing budgets understand how much of that money is going to waste, they will be more intentional about how they spend and who they want to connect with, rather than waste their time trying to play whack-a-mole with your with their ad spend. The problem, of course, is that if you're advertising anywhere and anywhere on the internet, you can't possibly keep up with all the bad content there is out there. So really, if we start thinking about intentional advertising, which is something that marketers today don't think about, they think about reaching their performance goals, their conversion rates, their click-through rates, and so on. But if we can really start to shift that paradigm towards where are we getting the most attention, where are we getting the most respect, how can we build a brand that people associate in a positive way, then I believe that we can one of the byproducts of that is that our ads won't be going to inappropriate places, or again, targeting people in inappropriate ways.
And I wanted to also ask you from a sort of campaigning perspective, two questions actually. The first is, we're obviously trying to generate campaigning momentum here around the idea of essentially less advertising, because we're talking about stopping targeted advertising to kids. I can't imagine that's going to land hugely brilliantly with people who advertise, because we're saying do less of it. Is that right? Or do you think there actually might be ways in which parts of the industry, and specifically some of the brands that you work with, would actually get behind a campaign that was shaped in a way that we're talking about it?
Shaped in the sense that we're doing less targeting? Yeah.
And less targeting specifically to children,
Yeah, absolutely. So brands are extremely sensitive to what people think. When you think about it as a marketer or as a brand, especially if you're one of the big brands that has been around for years or for decades, you have spent a lot of money investing in that brand. You've invested a lot of money in how people perceive the brand, right? This is not just marketing, this is the entire company's collective resources. So this could be like, this is billions of dollars. It's a brand equity. And they're afraid of losing that in the stroke of a eye. That's not the correct metaphor, I'm sorry. I'm blanking on what that metaphor is. But what Sleeping Giants has taught me and taught, I guess, everyone who's watching, is that when these issues are highlighted in public, brands will respond quickly. If someone were to start a campaign focused, a Sleeping Giants style campaign focused on kids, on the type of ads that kids are being targeted with, or the way that they're being targeted, that would absolutely become a topic on the agenda of any leadership team. That's something they would take very seriously. The only reason they're not taking it seriously is because no one has really brought it up in a meaningful way to the public. Once the public gets hold of what's going on, and someone is able to capture that and create a narrative of how destructive it is or how harmful it is to kids, that change will happen overnight.
Thank you. Sonia, I'm just going to ask you a question now, and then I think I'll hand over to Natasha, who will cover off some of the questions that have come in from attendees. I just wanted to ask you about this cutoff of 13, the magic 13 that seems to have been embedded in data protection law and others. Why is it that the UK government in particular, but I guess other governments have taken that option that was given to them of going down to 13 when it's clear that there are benefits to protecting kids above that age?
Well, the simplest answer is nobody knows, because the government has not given any account of how it came to that decision. And when you look at the map of Europe in the decision about the age of so-called digital consent, European countries made every decision between the age of 13 and 16, and I think none of them have given an explanation why. I've seen none of them refer to any evidence about the competence or concerns of children in their country, and I've seen none of them consult with children, as is in fact children's right. So it is all something of a puzzle, and the data that they do have, so the evidence that I did for the ICO and that others have done, shows very clearly that children come to an understanding about they come to some kind of understanding about how their data is being used and where they are, as it were, being datafied, somewhere during secondary school, and it varies enormously. And it's not that they come to a simple understanding, because of course there are many myths around how data is being used, and there's a lot of I mean, I think the difficulty for children learning this and understanding this and, as it were, being competent to make decisions, there is no real decision being offered to them. So if they want to be on Instagram because that's where their friends are, there's no point to them in reading the terms and conditions, whatever they say, however readable they're made, because they need to be where their friends are. And that's the same, the apps that their teachers set their homework on also collect their data and sell it in ways that teachers themselves don't or can't tell me about in a research interview. But they feel they have no choice, and the children certainly have no choice. So I think any question about children's competence at different ages or consent has got to be tied to the kinds of choices that this digital ecology offers them. And currently it offers them very little choice at all.
Thank you. Natasha, are you able to hear me for a start? And come in with the questions.
I am, yes, thank you. So yeah, we've had a couple of questions through. So we've had 3 in total. One of them's been answered on the chat, but we might put that out again, see if there's any extra answers. So the first one is about the companies themselves. So the companies who are using this data and who are wanting to sell to the children directly. So tend to be a kind of fashion, toys, and beauty brands. So the question is, what action can be taken against those brands to stop them using these destructive advertising practices, and who should take that action? So I think Nandini's gone some way to answering this question through her advice on hitting them where it hurts and if they feel their brands are threatened. But does anyone else want to have a go at answering this question? So what can be done to target the brands themselves, and how do we take action against them to stop them using these harmful practices to sell to kids?
Maybe I can jump in. So one thing that we should use is mobilizing and to really sensitize the social debate with parents' movements, and to bring them this kind of info, which is how harmful those practices are for the child's development. But also we should use legal strategies. We should really find ways to hold companies accountable for these practices, including, and we strongly believe that we could use the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the body of the Convention on the Rights of the Child to bring corporations to this debate and to enforce something that is applied to all countries but USA. But almost all companies from the USA, they have offices in different countries like UK and Ireland. So we can really find ways to bring them and to enforce this Article 3 from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the best interests of the child, including in the digital environment, and stop them to use children for economic exploitation, which the convention itself forbids.
Thank you, Pedro.
May I just jump in real quick? Since this is a UK-based group, I also wanted to just shout out to the Conscious Ad Network, which is a coalition of advertisers based in the UK that have sort of signed on to a manifesto that basically that they don't want to advertise on. And I'm just reading off their website here. They focus on diversity, on informed consent, on hate speech, as well as children's well-being. They are a really effective force in the advertising, among advertisers as well as tech companies. So if you are interested in teaming up with them or doing some kind of co-campaigning with them, they're definitely an organization to reach out to. Very uniquely positioned to get things done.
Thank you, Nandini. Yeah, and I should say that we are in touch, and we asked Harriet to come. She was sadly unable to make it. But, yeah, and also what I probably should have said in some of my opening remarks is that we are aware that there are a lot of initiatives within the industry focusing on ethics, focusing on all a range of ethical issues, both kind of directly as they relate to children, but also to the environment. And it was very encouraging this week to see that some money has finally gone into the Ad Green network, which is looking at how the actual mechanics of making ads can be drastically improved in terms of its sustainability. So yeah, very, very open to those discussions.
So I just wanted to jump in and add a couple of things. I mean, first of all, obviously, I think better laws and better regulation is much more effective than addressing this at a company by company basis or trying to create pressure within the industry. Having said that, I think that there is tremendous potential to picking a few target companies or target industry and engaging them and shaming them if they're engaging in behavioral advertising to children. I do think that there's an inherent tension, though, in some of what's being talked about. If part of the argument in addressing companies is that behavioral advertising isn't actually effective and you should switch to more effective methods, if our goal is protecting children from advertising, I don't know that that's the best tack that we want to take. And in fact, I think as we're thinking about a no behavioral ads to under 18 campaign, which I think has tremendous benefit, and we're all in and really excited to explore, but it's really important that we recognize, like for instance on YouTube, since on child-directed content, they've stopped having behavioral advertising, we've seen more influencer marketing happening on YouTube aimed at children, because if you're using if advertising is how you're going to fund media, then you're going to have to advertise to children to create media for children. And I don't think that necessarily some of the alternatives to behavioral advertising are things that are good in terms of materialism or children's well-being. There are things that are helpful to going after behavioral advertising, but we need to think about that. And in fact, I think there's a broader discussion to be had about advertising to children, not just behavioral advertising to children. We don't find, there seems to be an assumption, and I would agree with the assumption, that being a 21st century child or teen involves being online a significant amount of time, that's something that where childhood now takes place and schooling now takes place. We don't fund anything else for children through advertising that we think is part of something that they should be a major part of their lives, a required part of their lives. We don't say in order to go to the pediatrician, you have to give up all this data about yourself and then watch an ad. We don't say in order to go to school, you have to give, so so I do think that we need to be careful if, you know, I don't know that the effective argument on behavioral advertising really gets us where we want to go if all that means is that they're developing different effective ways of targeting children like influencer marketing.
Thank you, Josh.
I just want, sorry, Natasha, I'm conscious of us running out of time, and I did just want to make sure we get around to Tim, who, having started the webinar, has now sat there very quietly, not being asked anything. So I'm going to ask you something. What exactly is the difference between the kind of marketing that I guess you were first researching at the beginning of your career and its impact on children, which was offline, which was TV based and billboard based and all the rest of it, and today's more invasive marketing? Like, is there a significant difference in terms of the harm that you see as demonstrated by invasive digital marketing?
My best answer to that is we still don't know. We don't know that in terms of outcomes like materialism or outcomes like well-being. One of the things that strikes me is how little research there remains, you know, published in the scientific literature about these new forms of marketing, you know, so spending time on Facebook, spending time on YouTube, etc. I'm sure there's oodles of it in the proprietary data of these companies, but in terms of the broader scientific literature, by and large, there just isn't much that I'm aware of, at least. And I think that that's a call for scientists really to do more, and for there to be more funding in that end of things. So I have to say, I don't think we know, and I'm unaware of any changes showing that new marketing is worse than old marketing. I'm just not aware of those kinds of data.
If I can just come in at this point, I would wholeheartedly agree with that, Tim's point. The evidence is not quite where we would want it to be, so I think part of this campaign does need to be around gathering the right kind of evidence. But I think another part, and I wanted to come back to a point that Josh raised. So there's a major challenge here to the business model in the production of content that is designed for children. I mean, programming content or informational content, not advertising. And I'm curious, Josh, if you were, if your next point, as it were, was to suggest a different kind of a business model, because it is often said to me, without taking the data, without targeting the adverts, there is no content for children. Many providers will just pull out. And I would like to kind of see where we think, what is a positive direction here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need non-advertising funded models of media for children. I think we need, you know, I think subscription models are less manipulative than advertising funded models, significantly less. Obviously, they exclude people who can't afford them. So there needs to be a, you know, there needs to be public funding and mechanisms to allow everyone to have access to the same things, even those who can't afford it. But that, you know, if we were designing a system from scratch, I would hope that's what we would arrive in. I think we came to this moment in history with this coupling of media production and advertising, and so that's where we went. That's what we continued, and it's enormously profitable for a lot of people. But I don't know any child advocate who would say, you know, if a child wants to hang out with their friends online, they need to, you know, the only way that we can make that happen is to have the child give up all sorts of data about themselves, and so that they can be advertised back to, so that Facebook can do things like boast that they can advertise to a child when they're feeling emotionally vulnerable. Like, that's not, you know, if we were starting from scratch, I can't imagine that's where we would end up. If we were designing it based on what's best for children and not what's best for advertisers. So that's ultimately where I think we need to get. And I think, you know, but steps that get rid of the most manipulative and also, you know, one of the advantages of a behavioral advertising campaign is what it does to data collection, and data collection has harms in and of itself, not just at what comes back to you. But yes, absolutely, Sonia. I mean, why do we, if this is what kids need today is good media, why do we fund it with advertising? Because advertising doesn't lead to good media.
Right.
Thank you, Josh. Right, I had a feeling this might be a discussion which we would only just start rather than get to the heart of. But before we go to wrapping up, I just want to acknowledge that we're talking about children and we're talking about young people. We haven't really heard from any, not least because it probably wouldn't be appropriate to ask an 8-year-old to come on onto a webinar. But we did want to show you a video that a previous project of ours, funded by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Foundation, produced, where we asked a range of young teenagers for their experiences of the pressures of consumerism, the pressures of advertising, and the pressures of social media. This is just 3 minutes and then we'll come back.
My generation has grown up with adverts throughout our entire lives. They tell us how we should look and what we should own in order to fit in and be happy. But it's damaging, not only to the planet, but also to our mental health.
It's quite clear that a lot of adverts damage people's self-esteem, and things like adverts about being Beachbody ready, or even adverts for perfume and that kind of thing, they portray like bodies in a very unrealistic way.
And if you're like looking at yourself in the mirror going, I don't like this, and then you're looking at an Instagram page full of models, you're like, I don't look like this. That's not going to help you. That's not going to make you feel any better.
It's not fair on anybody. That we're supposed to be the ideology of perfect, and perfect's not real.
I think boys' body image is being sold as someone who's strong, muscular.
They think like, I want to look at the person in this advert because I know people will like me more.
It just really puts you in like a little pit where you go in a bit deeper and deeper each time you see something new.
Advertisers are using more and more sophisticated techniques to make us feel like we need certain things in order to fit in better, feel better, and to buy more than we need.
Popularity is directly involved in like what we buy and the things that we have.
It kind of leads to this idea that if you have all these products, you're going to be more successful and it's going to be easier for you.
It's a huge pressure for people my age to have to afford new clothes, shoes, cosmetics, and it really affects them mentally.
I definitely think that advertisers purposely like choose like vulnerable people to like promote their products to, just purely because it's easier to get them to like want to buy it.
The advertisers feel that they need to make us feel insecure, so we have to buy their things.
Even though we are young, we have minds of our own and we can make our own decisions. But it's hard when advertisers tell us that we have to lose weight to look good or wear specific brands to fit in.
It's not only just looks now, it's also a fake personality and an unrealistic personality. I think especially with with YouTube influencers, there's a whole look, there's a way that you present yourself and the way you speak.
You start to pressure yourself and then you doubt yourself.
Trust is becoming like a big issue among like people our sort of age who can't tell whether they're being sold something or not, and are trying like increasingly hard to distinguish between the two.
The pressure that people put on themselves, it does come from seeing these things over and over again.
It's just really horrible how companies are willing to do that as a way to get money and feel comfortable with putting across these messages all over social media and all over billboards and things, sort of aware that they're damaging people's self-esteem but will benefit financially from that.
Advertisers and influencers need to realise that they're targeting people who are still developing themselves, and you're affecting their lives, sometimes in ways that are negative and confusing, and you should know that, and you should think about that.
So, like I say, that was a video made last year, and that really was what sent Global Action Plan in the direction that we've gone, because we realised it's not fair to ask either young people or the parents of young people to resist the overwhelming pressures they are under to consume and to look and feel and act a certain way. we do need to tackle these issues on a systemic level, and that's really why this campaign why we want to get it going, and why we want to learn from everybody who we've heard from today, and people who are on the webinar as attendees. And I hope you will all be keen to stay part of this conversation. We're just going to post a link in the chat box now, where you can, would really hope that you will enter your details to keep involved in this conversation. It's effectively a campaign newsletter where, apart from anything else, we will send out notes from this webinar and try and answer also a number of the questions which I know have come through and we have not had time to answer. So do please click on that and fill in your details, and we promise not to bombard you with huge numbers of targeted ads, at least not intentionally anyway. The only other thing to ask, and we think this could be quite a nice way to initiate this campaign and make a bit of a public kind of announcement of the fact that we are campaigning, is that you would consider adding your name or your institution's name to a letter that a number of us on this call and elsewhere have drafted, in which we are directly asking some of the biggest internet platforms to turn off behavioural advertising to under 18s, where people have already identified themselves as 18 and often as under 18, and that's often the case on social media. So the link to a version of that letter, a draft version, and please keep it confidential, is on the chat box, and it would be great if you could email me or just sign up to that newsletter, and you'll find other ways to get in touch. So all that remains to say at this point is an enormous thank you to everybody on the call, particularly, of course, our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us and giving up your time. I'm sorry we couldn't speak for longer and ask you more questions, but a huge kind of virtual round of applause and thank you from all of us. And we really hope that this is the beginning of an exciting conversation, an exciting campaign where we get into all of the knotty issues that have been raised, but hopefully find a way out where we design or a part of an effort to design an internet ecosystem that is less reliant on exploiting young minds. So thank you very much. Do sign up to the newsletter. Do have a look at the joint letter and let us know if you'd like to be part of that. Thank you very much.